Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome. This webinar is hosted by the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. My name is Suzanne Hill. I'm Director of Advocacy and Outreach for the Center. And our goal today for bringing this webinar to child passenger safety technician instructors is to provide you all with an explanation of the research behind the new recommendations and to help you address any concerns or questions you might be confronted with in the field. For a little housekeeping, this webinar quickly sold out, and we have 500 people registered. Doesn't look like all of them are online yet, so hopefully they'll be coming online during my introduction here. Because we sold out so quickly, we are taping the webinar, and after the webinar, it will be posted at www.chop.edu/carseat as quickly as we can produce the video. We aim to get it up there within 2 weeks sooner if possible. While we're limited to 500 attendees for today, our hope is that all 30,000 child passenger safety technicians will have access to this video should they want to view it. Easy links will be provided in the next issues of Research in Action, which is our center's e-newsletter, as well as CPS Express. The slides will also be available as a PDF file. During this talk, you'll note that we don't have all the references and the footnotes on these slides just to try to keep the slides a little clean. So the PDF file will include all the references for these stats that you'll see here today. If you have any questions as we go along, please type them into the Q&A text box at the top of your screen. After Dr. Durbin finishes his talk, we will address as many questions as possible. We will prioritize them by looking for common threads within the questions. Because of the large group, it's not possible to open up the lines for audio or verbal questions and discussion. Also, participants will not be able to view your texted questions. So if you're trying to communicate with other people on the webinar, that won't work. From previous webinar feedback, we've learned that this is very distracting for the participants. If you are having technical difficulties, please reread your confirmation emails. There you will find links to join the meeting and also to download the free software from Microsoft Live Meeting for first-time users if you haven't already done that. There is also a toll-free number in the confirmation emails for you to tap into the audio. So if you're having problems with the audio, you need to call in and use your phone for that. That toll-free number is 1-800-214-0745, and then you'll need to get the participant code from your confirmation email and type that in. There's also a link in the email to contact Microsoft Live Meeting if you have additional technical difficulties during the webinar. At this point, the folks here at CHOP won't be able to help you with any technical issues. So it will not help you to text about these in your Q&A text box, just so you don't waste your effort doing that. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank the Association of Global Automakers for making this webinar possible through their generous sponsorship. And a real warm thank you to Safe Kids USA and Carrie Charlesmore for their excellent help in getting the word out about this webinar. Our speaker today is Dr. Dennis Durbin. He's a professor of pediatrics in the Division of Emergency Medicine at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also the co-scientific director for the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at CHOP. You might remember Partners with Child Passenger Safety. He was the co-principal investigator of that research study, which was a 10-year research collaboration of CHOP and State Farm insurance companies, which produced dozens of published studies that have helped set direction for child occupant restraint laws and policies at the state and federal levels over the past decade. PCPS data also have helped child restraint manufacturers and automakers improve the safety design of their products. You'll see much of that science behind these recommendations you'll hear about today. A lot of that comes from studies authored by Dr. Durbin and his colleagues here at CHOP. Dr. Durbin is also the lead author of the AAP's recent update to their Child Passenger Safety Policy Statement and Technical Report, published in this month's issue of Pediatrics, which is why he is ideally positioned to bring this information to you. So without further ado, I will turn this webinar over to Dennis Durbin.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. It is a pleasure to to be able to share a lot of the hard work of the Committee on Injury, Violence, and Poison Prevention of the American Academy of Pediatrics, who authored these recommendations, and I look forward to sharing them with all of you and to hearing some of your questions and feedback on those recommendations. Well, just as a little bit of history, obviously child passenger safety is an issue of significant importance to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And when the Academy wants to have official position statements on issues of relevance to children's health, they do that through a policy process. The Academy first issued a child passenger safety policy statement in 2002, and its policy statements routinely are reviewed every 5 years. And one of three things can happen when a policy statement comes up for review. It can be retired if the Academy feels the issue is no longer of importance. It can be reaffirmed if the Academy's position on that policy has not changed, or it can be revised if the Academy believes that there has been some change in the landscape on a particular issue that should prompt a revision to its policy statement. So this statement was reviewed in 2007, and it was reaffirmed, but at the same time, the Committee on Injury, Violence, and Poison Prevention recognized that significant changes had begun to take place, in particular with the amount and type of scientific evidence that was available on which child passenger safety recommendations could be based. And so while the committee voted to reaffirm the statement so that it remained in place, we also initiated a series of activities that have resulted in this new revised policy statement being released this month. You may be surprised that it seems that so much time took place between a decision to revise the statement and the actual publication of that statement. Policy is something the Academy takes very seriously. There is a several-year-long process with dozens and dozens of steps to go from an intent to revise a policy statement to when that policy statement appears publicly. And so as much as we would all like for that process to be a little more expedited, it is a diligent and thoughtful process because it needs to result in something that the Academy can stand behind. As I mentioned, the prime motivation for the Academy revising its policy statement was that much had changed over the prior decade. As I mentioned, a lot of expansion in the scientific evidence. The legislative and regulatory environments have changed substantially over the past 10 years. As I'll show you in a moment, restraint use among children has dramatically increased, and as Suzanne mentioned, automotive manufacturers and restraint system suppliers have changed their designs of their products. And so because the landscape had changed so significantly, the Academy did believe that it was time to revise its policy statement. And as Suzanne mentioned, this statement and an accompanying technical report which summarizes all of the evidence behind the recommendations have been released in this month's issue of the journal Pediatrics. So what I will do over the next 30 to 40 minutes or so is just provide a quick summary of the evidence behind the revised recommendations and highlight which ones have changed, what is different from the prior policy, and point out some of the reasons for those changes. So despite significant progress in child passenger safety over the past decade, which I'll share with you in a moment, motor vehicle crash is still in part a very significant burden on the health and well-being of children in this country. This table is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which they produce every year, looking at the leading causes of death for various age groups of people in this country. And as you can see, unintentional motor vehicle traffic injuries have fallen, thankfully, to now the second leading cause of death for children under age 5, but remain the leading cause of death for older children and youth. Each year, crashes claim more than 5,000 lives of children and youth under age 21. And for every death, there are 400 additional children and youth who are seriously injured in crashes. So the protection of children, really in all forms of transportation, but in particular in automobiles, remains a very significant priority for the American Academy of Pediatrics. I often like to think of the fact that we're in what I refer to as the modern era of child passenger safety, and I can trace the beginning of this era back to a very particular date in history, July 8, 1996, not too long ago, just about 15 years ago. when this front page story was published in USA Today, which described the very tragic situation where a number of young children were killed in relatively minor crashes by deploying passenger airbags. The reason I believe that this event sort of initiated the so-called modern era in child passenger safety is because I believe that the occurrence of this tragedy focused the attention of our country from the industry to academics to policymakers to the general public on the unique needs of children's safety in the automobile. Certainly there had been some efforts in trying to improve the safety of children in automobiles, but I think it took this issue for that to become a compelling area of interest for all stakeholders who are involved in the safety of children in cars. And as many of you know and have participated in, there has been an explosion of programs regarding education and legislation to try to get more children into the rear seat of vehicles and to use age-appropriate restraints. So here's part of the good news in the modern era of child passenger safety. If you looked at the number of children under age 16 who died in automobile crashes every year during the 1990s, you would have found that that number was around 2,000 kids per year and essentially remained unchanged throughout most of that decade. Beginning in the late 1990s, though, in part due to several of these efforts in reaction to the airbag catastrophe, death rates for children in automobile crashes have steadily declined. And in the 12 years between 1997 and 2009, there have been nearly 5,000 lives of young children that have been saved if one sort of extrapolates what the situation would have been if nothing would have changed. And I think this is always a good moment for many of you to pause and consider your role in a lot of this success. Much of this success has been due to the child passenger safety technician community getting proper information into the hands of parents at a very grassroots level. And so all of you should take some pride in this achievement. It has been a very notable achievement, something we're all very proud of. However, I don't think any of us believes that we can feel satisfied with still about 1,000 kids per year dying in automobile crashes. And so there's still work to be done. And in part, a lot of that work is because children continue to ride more and more in automobiles every year. These data come from the National Household Transportation Survey and show that kids under age 16 spend nearly as much time in automobiles as adults do, averaging over 3 trips per day, nearly an hour of time riding around in automobiles per day. And, of course, you can't get into a crash if you're not in the car. And the more you're in the car, the more likely you are to be in a crash. So protecting children in automobiles on every trip they take remains a very important issue for all of us. Now, I know should be review for most of you. You're expert in this area, but the reason restraints are so important, of course, is that they reduce the risk of being ejected in a crash. They distribute the energy from the crash over strong bones as opposed to soft tissues. This is particularly important in young developing children. And they help to limit crash forces by prolonging the deceleration of the crash. This video that's running here really illustrates sort of a best case versus worst case scenario for the role of restraints in the vehicle. In the front seat, you see a simulated 6-year-old who's unrestrained in a frontal impact crash in a vehicle with a passenger airbag, is thrown forward due to pre-impact braking and is struck by the deploying passenger airbag. This was one of the typical scenarios in which children died from passenger airbags. Contrast that with that same child restrained properly for his age in a belt positioning booster seat in the back seat of the vehicle, and you can see the very more ideally way in which that child's body movement is controlled during the force of the crash. And of course, all of you know that there are various restraints that need to be used by children as they grow and develop throughout childhood, from rear-facing infant-only restraints through convertible seats that can be used both rear and forward-facing and up to our belt-positioning booster seats. And of course, we always think about the restraints that are in the vehicle, the seatbelt systems and the airbags, as well as these forms of add-on restraints. And again, we'll sort of review each of these as we go through the recommendations. So one of the reasons why we've seen such a decrease in the number of kids killed in crashes every year is that the number of kids using car seats and booster seats has steadily increased over the last 10 to 12 years. These data in this graph come from the Partners for Child Passenger Safety study, which was a large study of children involved in automobile crashes. And as you can see, the proportion of 6 to 8-year-olds in particular who were using car seats and booster seats increased substantially from 1999, the first year that we collected data in that study, to 2007, which was the final year that we collected data. However, there was still room for improvement. Over half of those kids, so what I refer to as a pediatrician as middle-aged children, sort of between the ages of 4 and 8, were still not properly restrained for their age. Somewhat more recent data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration from their national survey of the use of booster seats shows that in 2008 and 2009, a little over half of 4 to 7-year-olds were using some form of a child restraint system, either a child safety seat or a booster seat. And these numbers remain relatively steady over these 2 years of data collection. You can see that about 1 out of 3 kids in this age group are using seat belts, and around 1 out of 9 kids or so is completely unrestrained in the vehicle. So still plenty of room for improvement, but we are making progress in getting kids into age-appropriate restraints more consistently. So with that kind of background in mind, let me now introduce you to the Academy's new best practice recommendations for child passenger safety. And one of the things that those of you who go to the policy statement and review it will notice is that it's quite brief, and it is built around this algorithm. The Academy wanted this policy statement in particular to be as easily implementable by pediatricians in their practice as possible. And one of the ways in which the Academy is doing this for a lot of its policy development process is to develop policies in the form of these decision algorithms. Because one of the ways in which these can be used by pediatricians in practice is to be programmed into electronic health records so that it makes it easy for a pediatrician, based on an age, weight, and size of a particular child, to rapidly find the right best practice recommendation for that child. And so we developed the policy in the form of an algorithm that guides a pediatrician through a decision-making process that will result in them being able to provide the most appropriate recommendation for the family that they're seeing on a particular day in their office. And you can see that it is an algorithm that is intended to be used at all what are called health supervision visits or well-child checkups, at which children are typically weighed and measured. And with that information, a pediatrician can work their way through this algorithm and arrive at the right recommendation. Now, you'll notice the first decision branch point is whether or not the child has special health needs. And this is because there are a significant number of kids who do have special health care needs, and they are not intended to be covered by this policy statement. We're going to break apart the various pieces of this algorithm in just a moment. But let me just spend just a moment talking about children with special health needs. Many of you know that these are kids typically with musculoskeletal conditions or prematurity, muscle tone abnormalities, or special hardware like tracheostomy tubes, and they simply can't be restrained in the typically available car seats and booster seats, but require specialized restraints. The Academy does have separate policy for the transport of children with special health needs that can be found on the Academy's website. And so I'm just making a mention of it here because everything that I'm going to say subsequent to this does not address children with special health needs, but the more typical healthy child that a pediatrician would see in their office practice. So the first recommendation, the one that has been receiving a lot of the attention as we've been making these recommendations publicly available, is that all infants and toddlers should ride in a rear-facing car safety seat until they are 2 years of age or until they reach the highest weight or height allowed by their car safety seats manufacturer. And all of you, of course, will recognize that the mention of 2 years of age is different than the way this recommendation was previously worded. Where in the prior iteration of this recommendation, the Academy still wanted kids to remain rear-facing for as long as possible, but identified 1 year and 20 pounds as sort of minimum thresholds at which a child should remain rear-facing. And I think what the committee was intending to do with changing the language here was, rather than promoting a minimum guideline for rear-facing, we really wanted to promote an optimal guideline for rear-facing and introduce a little bit more clarity, in particular for pediatricians and families, for a goal to reach 2 years of age. So as you can see, as this portion of the algorithm does assume that kids under age 2 are being restrained in some form of a car seat, either an infant-only or a convertible seat, we know that that is generally the case, that car seat use by kids under age 2 is virtually universal in this country by most sociodemographic groups. There are very small pockets of lower socioeconomic populations that are still not consistently using car seats, but the vast majority of children in this country under age 2 are. And so as you see, anyone using an infant-only seat obviously needs to remain rear-facing, and children who are in convertible seats but have not outgrown the rear-facing limits for that seat also should remain rear-facing. And again, the guidance is that this corresponds to all kids under age 2. And most of you are probably aware of the fact that the way in which rear-facing seats really provide optimal protection for young infants is that because their heads are relatively large and their centers of gravity are much higher in the neck than for older children and adults, as well as that there are several anatomic features in the neck of a young developing child that put the child at particular risk of head and cervical spine injury in the event of a crash. And by riding rear-facing, that child's head and neck are better supported by the structure of the car seat, and in the event of a crash, most of which involves some form of frontal component to the impact, the child's head and neck and really their whole body are better controlled, and the forces of the crash are distributed more evenly across their back, preventing that sort of whipping motion of the head and neck on the torso. Now, we know that we do not have universal rear-facing for all kids under age 1. We didn't even have people hitting our minimum guidelines. The most recent data would suggest that about 1 out of 5 infants under age 1 is turned forward-facing prematurely. So this is clearly going to be a challenge for some families to keep their children rear-facing even past age 1, let alone up to age 2. We recognize that this will be a challenge. But the data on which this recommendation was revised really consisted of a couple of studies, some from Sweden, where children remain rear-facing to age 4 and move from a rear-facing car seat directly into a booster seat, but also one U.S. study utilizing a primary source of crash data on kids that have been used by other researchers in this country for many years, which showed that for kids up to age 2, those who were in forward-facing car seats were about 1.8 times more likely to be seriously injured than kids who were riding rear-facing. And when these researchers looked specifically at kids between their first and second birthdays, so from 12 to 23 months of age, they found that the forward-facing kids were over 5 times as likely to be injured in crashes than the rear-facing kids. This study was published in 2007 in the journal Injury Prevention. Was a well-done study. I think the authors themselves would recognize some limitations to that study. These were the best available evidence that the committee had when considering revising the recommendation, and the Academy's committee felt that these data were compelling enough to justify extending that rear-facing recommendation to age 2. Now, of course, that raises the issue of, well, how do we know that we've got car seat products available on the market that can accommodate these older kids, particularly given the fact that we're in the midst of a childhood obesity epidemic in this country. About a third of the kids in the United States right now are classified as either obese or overweight, meaning their body mass index is at least greater than the 85th percentile for their age. And so the intersection of child passenger safety with childhood obesity occurs in part with this recommendation to extend the rear-facing to age 2. Thankfully, the car seat manufacturers, recognizing the proliferation of obesity in this country, had already been extending the rear-facing limits for their seats over the last several years. So that if you look at the products that are available in the 2011 American Academy of Pediatrics product listing, 30 of the 35 convertible seats now available can accommodate kids rear-facing up to 35 pounds, which is the greater than 95th percentile for 24-month-olds. So we do believe that there are sufficient products available in the marketplace today. Many parents have these products right now in their cars to accommodate this recommendation. So the second recommendation was that all kids 2 years and older, or those who are younger than 2 who've outgrown the rear-facing limits for their car seat, should then use a forward-facing car safety seat with a harness for as long as possible, up to the highest weight or height allowed by their seat's manufacturer. And this recommendation really has not appreciably changed from the way it was worded previously, except for the input of kids over age 2. And again, you can see that for those who are under age 2, if they've outgrown the weight limits for their convertible seat, they move into this recommendation, as well as most kids between 2 and 8 years of age. And again, the evidence behind this recommendation, there is evidence on how forward-facing car seats prevent deaths. That evidence includes a 54% reduction in risk of death when compared to children who are unrestrained in the vehicle. But of course, these days, that's not as useful a comparison anymore because fewer and fewer children are riding completely unrestrained in the vehicle. There have been a number of studies published in the last 5 years in particular comparing the risk of death for kids in forward-facing car seats to similar-age kids who are in seat belts. And the evidence generally consistently has shown somewhere in the neighborhood of a 15 to 20 or 25% reduction in risk of death for kids aged 2 to 6 years who are in forward-facing car seats. When we look at the evidence behind how car seats prevent injuries, not just deaths, but non-fatal injuries, evidence from the Partners for Child Passenger Safety study show that for kids 1 to 4 years of age, forward-facing car seats reduce the risk of serious injury by about 71%, so a very significant reduction in non-fatal injuries as well. So the evidence behind the performance of forward-facing car seats is quite compelling. The third recommendation is for the use of belt positioning booster seats, and states that all kids, again, who have outgrown the forward-facing weight or height limits for their car safety seat should use a belt positioning booster seat until the seat belt fits properly. And we say that this is typically when they have reached 4 feet 9 inches in height and are between 8 and 12 years of age. Now, all of you know from being on the front lines of seeing lots of kids in booster seats that there is quite a broad range of sizes and shapes of kids, as well as vehicle seat and seat belt geometry that's relevant for this recommendation. The committee deliberated at some length over the inclusion of the 4 foot 9 inch threshold and decided to keep it, again, as a way of providing a target for pediatricians and parents to see that they probably need to be using a booster seat for much longer than they had originally intended. Those of you who are familiar with the evidence behind 4 feet 9 know that it came from a relatively large study done many years ago at the University of Michigan and did find that this was the height threshold at which children of a variety of shapes and sizes would most commonly fit in the vehicle seat belts across a wide range of vehicles. And again, so you may encounter situations where a child who's shorter than this fits adequately in a vehicle seatbelt. These recommendations are not meant to be prescriptive, but to provide guidance. And so I don't want any of you to think that you can't continue to use your experience and good professional judgment when making recommendations for parents on an individual child in an individual vehicle. But it is the case that for most vehicles and most kids, they won't fit the seatbelt geometry until they're about 4 foot 9 inches tall. And again, all of you know how to assess whether or not a seatbelt fits properly. Again, this language is included in the policy statement as a way of educating pediatricians and then hopefully the parents that they speak to because one of the things we would like to happen as a result of these revised recommendations is that parents and pediatricians become better able to assess the seatbelt fit for their particular child and their particular vehicle. All of you are, I'm sure, quite familiar with the manner by which booster seats work. They work to basically position the lap and shoulder portions of the seatbelt the way they were designed to fit an occupant, low over the hips and pelvis for the lap portion and across the middle of the chest and shoulder for the shoulder portion. This simulated 35-mile-per-hour frontal impact crash just illustrates the dramatic difference in control of a child's movement or kinematics, and particularly the movement of the head, if that child is improperly placed in a lap and shoulder seatbelt, as opposed to using a belt positioning booster seat. And again, I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with the so-called seatbelt syndrome, a constellation of injuries to the abdomen and to the spine that can result when young children are placed in vehicle seatbelts prematurely. And as you can see in this photograph, what commonly happens is that the seatbelt rides up over the abdomen. The shoulder harness is too close to the neck and face. Many kids will then place it under their arm or behind their back. The lower photo shows an unfortunate consequence of these injuries. You can see exactly where the seatbelt was at the time of this crash. It was up over the abdomen, placing that child at risk for injuries to their abdominal organs as well as to their lumbar spine. The evidence behind booster seats similarly consists of some evidence behind their performance in reducing the risk of death for kids in crashes. There's been one study published looking at the performance of boosters when compared to unrestrained children 4 to 8 years of age, demonstrating significant reductions in the risk of death for young kids compared to unrestrained children. That same study also compared booster seats to 4 to 8-year-olds who were in seatbelts, and could find no evidence that boosters provided an incremental reduction in risk of death when compared to the seatbelts. And these authors suggested, and I would say I'm supportive of their position on this, that because boosters serve to position the belt so that it fits properly, therefore reducing the risk of some belt-related injuries, as you'll see in a moment, while boosters may reduce the risk of non-fatal injuries in crashes, they're probably not offering much better protection than the seatbelt itself when it comes to reducing the risk of death in a crash. And I don't think that this necessarily undermines the recommendation to use booster seats because, as you'll see on this slide, the evidence behind their performance in reducing the risk of non-fatal injuries is quite compelling. Again, data from the Partners for Child Passenger Safety study, which has been recently replicated and then also replicated by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in a separate data source, shows that boosters reduce the risk of non-fatal injuries for 4 to 8-year-olds by 45% compared to similar-age kids that are in seatbelts. And so if we think about the protection of kids 4 to 7 years of age, there's about a 1% or so risk of serious injury to kids who are in booster seats, about a 1.5% risk of injury to those who are in seatbelts, and a significantly increased 7% risk of injury to those who are completely unrestrained. The last recommendation that pertains to restraint use for kids dealt with lap and shoulder belts and says that when children are old enough and large enough to use the vehicle seatbelt alone, they should always use the lap and shoulder seatbelts for optimal protection. And so again, this is just a different branch point for whether or not the child is above 4 feet 9 inches in height or if the seatbelt fits properly. Some of you may know that since 1989, lap and shoulder seatbelts have been required by NHTSA to be in outboard seating positions in the rear seats of vehicles. And beginning in all vehicles with model year 2005 and over need to have lap and shoulder seatbelts in the center rear seating position. I'm sure some of you still encounter many vehicles at child seat clinics where the center rear seating position only has a lap seatbelt available. Hopefully, as time goes by, we will see fewer and fewer of these vehicles in the seat. The evidence behind the role of lap and shoulder seatbelts is that they reduce the risk of serious injury or death by about 40% for young school-age and young adolescent children when compared to children who are completely unrestrained. There was an interesting study done using state of Wisconsin data that suggested that if all kids 8 to 15 years of age were in lap and shoulder belts, compared to the 72% at the time that the study was conducted, these investigators estimated that there would have been 45% fewer deaths in the state of Wisconsin and about 32% fewer hospitalizations among 8 to 15-year-olds. So very significant reductions if we could get universal use of lap and shoulder seatbelts by 8 to 15-year-olds. When it comes to whether or not the shoulder belt, the shoulder portion provides some added protection compared to the lap belt alone, data from the partner study did show that children who were in the center rear seating position of vehicles with a lap and shoulder seatbelt showed an 81% fewer risk of serious injuries compared to kids that were using only the lap belt, and most of this reduction was a reduction in abdominal injuries. So again, better control of the torso by the shoulder belt does directly reduce the risk of, in particular, intra-abdominal injuries to kids. The final recommendation by the Academy was that all kids 13 years of age and younger should be in the rear seats of vehicles for optimal protection. Again, this recommendation did not change from previous. The situation behind rear seating is that fewer and fewer kids over the last decade are sitting in the front seats of vehicles. This is particularly true among kids who are sort of booster age, if you will, anywhere from 3 to 8 or 9 years of age. We've seen steadily increasing proportions of kids moving to the rear seats. Again, much of this was in response to public education campaigns in the wake of the airbag catastrophe. And the evidence is quite compelling that no matter how you're restrained or whether you're restrained, you're always at a lower risk of injury when you're in the rear seat of the vehicle if you're under age 13. These are data from the Partners for Child Passenger Safety studies showing the risks of serious injury to kids based on various combinations of restraint use and seating position. And you can see that no matter how a child is restrained, they're always at a lower risk of injury when they're in the rear seat compared to the front. And this rear seat benefit does extend to side impact collisions, which may not be intuitively obvious, but because those collisions frequently do involve some element of a frontal movement of the vehicle, it's always better to be in the rear seat of the vehicle, and we have demonstrated a more than 60% reduction in risk of injury to kids in the rear seats in side impact crashes as well as frontal crashes. So that summarizes the 5 recommendations made by the Academy and the evidence behind them. In the accompanying technical report that was also published in the electronic version of Pediatrics this month, there were a number of other issues that we addressed relevant to child passenger safety. Chief among them was children and airbags. And again, I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with the fact that, as I mentioned early on, in the mid-1990s, airbags, despite saving thousands of adult lives, cost the lives of over 100 young children, typically either rear-facing infants placed in the front seat or, as I showed you in that simulation, young school-age children that were either inappropriately restrained or unrestrained in relatively low-impact collisions. In response to this, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, through public awareness campaigns that many of you may have been involved in, did recommend that all kids under age 13 should sit in the rear. That was the Academy's position at the time, and we're reaffirming that with these recent recommendations. The NHTSA also changed the performance criteria for the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard number 208, which governs the performance of airbags. This change in the standard encouraged the development of airbags that would deploy with less force. And these airbags became available in the marketplace really beginning with model year 1998 vehicles, quite quickly after the airbag problem was identified. And we and others have demonstrated a reduced risk of serious injuries to young kids who are exposed to these so-called second-generation airbags when compared to first-generation bags. So the situation is better for kids, but I want to point out that these risks of injuries to kids exposed to second-generation bags are still quite a bit higher than corresponding risks of injury to similar-age kids who would have been in the rear seats of these vehicles. So even though second-generation airbags may not be as harmful to children as first-generation bags, it is still better to be in the rear seat of the vehicle away from the airbag deployment if you're a child under age 13. There's a section in the technical report dealing with side impact airbags. These are more recently proliferating in the vehicle fleet, so there's less of an experience with side airbags in kids than there is with the frontal passenger airbags. Though the headline here is that while the risks of injury to kids exposed to side impact airbags are similar to the second-generation frontal airbags, they're still higher than we would like them to be. We as yet have not seen particular problems with side airbags in children like we saw with the front passenger airbags. I think there's still more data, more time, more experience that needs to be accrued here, but the evidence to date is that if a child is restrained properly for their age, the side airbags are not likely to be injurious to a child. There was a section in the technical report summarizing the current state of child restraint laws in this country. This, again, was one of those major things that has changed over the last decade. A decade ago, we had no child restraint laws that required the use of booster seats for older children. And now 47 states in the District of Columbia have some form of a child restraint law that does promote the use of a booster seat. As you can see in this map with the different color codings that correspond with various age limits for the laws, we have a patchwork of different laws in this country, not all of which, in fact, only one of which, really two of which reflect these current best practice recommendations. So there's still improvement that could be seen in the specific provisions behind booster seat laws, but I'm pleased with the initial proliferation of these laws over the last 6 to 7 years in particular. Some other considerations that were addressed in the technical report, there was a section around the issues related to children left unattended in or around vehicles and therefore at risk of death or serious injury from backovers, hyperthermia, or power window entrapment. There was a section dealing with the particular safety concerns of children riding in pickup trucks, that highlighted both the elevated risk of injury to children in the rear seats of compact extended cab pickups, as well as the obvious serious risk of injury and death to children riding in the cargo area of pickups. Because this policy statement was meant to cover children's safety in a wide range of motorized vehicles, we also covered the issue of commercial airline travel for children. As a section in the technical report, and the Academy continues to recommend that despite the fact that the Federal Aviation Administration does not require the use of car seats by children under age 2, the Academy still encourages parents to purchase the seat and use their car seat that's approved for use on commercial aircraft for all kids, essentially trying to replicate best practice recommendations on the road as well as they possibly can in the air. And the last thing I wanted to point out, in particular to this audience, because I know many of you are child passenger safety technicians and technician instructors, is that your role in promoting best practice recommendations was highlighted in the policy statement and accompanying technical report. The committee essentially considered you consultants to pediatricians in the same manner that a pediatrician might consult a pediatric pulmonologist or allergist or hematologist when they're confronted with a situation in their practice that goes beyond their own level of expertise. The Academy is hoping that these recommendations do establish a new and improved sort of baseline level of knowledge that all pediatricians will have when it comes to child passenger safety recommendations, but we acknowledge that there will often be times when pediatricians are confronted with situations in their practice that aren't managed by the algorithm or that extend beyond that pediatrician's level of expertise. And what we are suggesting to pediatricians is that they identify a number of child passenger safety technicians in their local area that they can contact or refer patients to as a consultant when they're faced with a situation that goes beyond their own level of expertise. And we've included in these statements the various websites for pediatricians to use as additional resources in their practice. So I will pause there, and I believe there are a number of questions that have been submitted. If you give us just a moment, I will read back the question and provide an answer, and we'll try to cover as many as we can in about the 10 or 15 minutes we have remaining in the webinar.
Sure. And Suzanne's back online here, too, with Dennis. So we'll just try to go through these questions. There were some common themes, some better handled by Dennis, perhaps a couple that might be better handled by me. A lot of the questions had to do with what are the efforts out there to develop dissemination materials to help practitioners, such as the instructors and the technicians, to communicate these new recommendations consistently. And I'm not sure if you have any detailed information what the AAP is planning. I know these recommendations are really written for pediatricians, not necessarily in health literacy levels for patient families, et cetera. And so what do you know about intentions? And another question that was related to this was for parents who actually challenge the recommendation. Will there be brochures developed for that?
So I know that the Academy, again, the way this policy statement was formatted is that the algorithm and some accompanying tables of explanation were formatted in a way that the intention is that pediatricians would photocopy this and perhaps post it in their office to be used as a guide in their practice. The Academy also publishes a number of sort of related materials in child passenger safety that have been recently updated to reflect these new recommendations that are designed to be used directly by families. And these are some of the most commonly purchased and distributed items from the publications section of the Academy. So all of the Academy's both professional and family-oriented materials that are touched by these recommendations have been updated and are now available for distribution by pediatricians in their practice. There are a number of both online and in-person efforts that the Academy will engage in over the next 6 to 12 months to continue to educate their members about these recommendations that will probably culminate this fall at the national meeting of the American Academy of Pediatrics, where a number of workshops are planned to ensure that pediatricians are getting this information and implementing it in their practice. I mentioned early on that part of the reason the recommendations were developed in the form of an algorithm is so that pediatricians can program this into electronic health records in their practice. There are efforts underway now to encourage practices who are increasingly relying on electronic health records to do so. So those are some of the efforts that I'm aware of to try to get this information into the hands of pediatricians and in turn into the hands of families.
Okay, and then are those materials from AAP.org also available for the CPS instructors to go to and download, for instance, like the algorithm?
Truthfully, I don't know the answer to that question. You'll see on the slide that's up on the screen now contact information for Bonnie Koziel. She would probably be the best person to contact to see if technicians can directly access the materials that are more typically made available to Academy members.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen when the AAP talks and updates its recommendations, all the other trusted sources of information for child passenger safety might be a little bit behind, but they eventually upgrade and update their information as well. And I know that we're doing that here at Children's Hospital. Our website that I know a lot of you use, www.chop.edu/carseat, we made basic content updates to make sure that website is in alignment with the new recommendations, and we are doing more aggressive updates to the website, including redoing all the videos, which is very exciting. They'll be very similar because I know they work well, but they're being updated to reflect the new recommendations, and they should be online sometime this summer, probably. I'm hoping earlier this summer, but it could be later this summer. And so we're really excited about that. We're also updating the four-year family fact sheets that are resources from that website as well, and they're undergoing updates.
I should also mention that I'm sure some of you are now aware that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration issued its own revised recommendations for child passenger safety on the same date that the Academy did. And thankfully, this was somewhat of a coordinated effort between the two organizations. And while the NHTSA recommendations read differently, the two sets of recommendations are not contrary to one another. They serve different purposes. They serve somewhat different audiences. The organizations serve different roles publicly. I think that's why the language is somewhat different between the two. Life would be simpler if they said exactly the same thing. They don't. But I want people to know that there's no one at NHTSA or the Academy, or just me speaking personally, who believes that the different wording puts the two organizations in conflict with one another. And so if you encounter in your practice families who are confused by the different wording of the recommendations, you can assure them that they are not intended to, even though they may inadvertently create confusion, they really are consistent with one another.
Thank you. And then also just another towards how the information is being made available. We had a question about the presentation being available to use for update classes. We are taping this, so the a movie of this webinar will be available from www.chop.edu/carseat, as well as a PDF version of the slides. So those things will be downloadable resources that you can print, that you can put up on your computer and use, et cetera. And also, if you just wanted to have Dennis explaining it directly, you can have folks look at the videos. In regards to their being able to use for continuing education credits, we do not offer continuing education credits, but if you're familiar with the way Safe Kids does theirs, you can follow their guidelines for continuing education credits. This webinar specifically, you will be getting continuing education credits by an email after this, confirming that you participated in the email or in the webinar, so you'll be able to use that. Okay, on to some other questions. So we have some more technical questions here to work with. We had a question about regarding the rear-facing recommendation. What about infant-only child safety seats that go to 22 pounds? Parents might read this recommendation that and assume that when they outgrow the infant-only car seats that they can turn forward-facing. How do we address this?
Yeah, so the way if pediatricians follow the algorithm, they'll see that if a child outgrows their rear-facing limit for an infant-only seat, they need to move to a convertible seat and remain in that seat rear-facing until they've outgrown the rear-facing limits for that seat. So again, the algorithm is intentionally trying to encourage pediatricians to see a natural movement from a rear-facing infant-only seat to a rear-facing convertible seat, and it remains rear-facing until the rear-facing limit is reached. We'll have to see if in practice pediatricians are effective at making that recommendation, but that was an issue that we were clearly aware of, and the way the algorithm is designed, it should promote pediatricians if they follow it. And again, if it's programmed into an electronic health record, it would automatically promote the use of a rear-facing convertible seat.
Okay. And just confirming the flow chart, we've gotten some questions about it. Appears that AP is recommending the age 2. What about if they're age 2 and they're not yet maxing out of their forward-facing seat?
Yeah, so I think that, again, for age children that may be over age 2 but still within a rear-facing limit for a car seat, we would want that child to remain rear-facing. We do recognize that there's an input to a branch in the algorithm that says if you're between 2 and 8 years of age, you're likely going to end up in either a forward-facing car seat or a booster seat. It's through some of the materials that are made available in the accompanying table of explanations that I did not share with you that we would want pediatricians to continue to recommend rear-facing for age kids who might still fit in a convertible seat within the rear-facing limits. But again, I think that it is likely that pediatricians may go ahead and recommend that a child who could conceivably still fit rear-facing based on size and weight, but who is over age 2, they may recommend that child can be switched to forward-facing. I think that if they waited until age 2 to do that, that would recommend a significant progress from the way things have been in the last decade. And I think, just practically speaking, as both a practicing pediatrician and as a child passenger safety researcher, progress is made in increments, and I'm confident that with these new recommendations we will see more consistent evidence-based recommendations being made by pediatricians and overall the situation improving. And in 5 years' time, when it comes time to review these recommendations again, the Academy will decide if further revisions are necessary.
Okay, and so there are a series of questions here having to do with the booster seat recommendation. One very specific question here regarding the data. Does the seatbelt versus forward-facing car seat data include belt positioning booster usage with seatbelts?
No. So the data that I presented from studies that have looked at the effectiveness of forward-facing car seats versus seat belts, the belted kids there were kids only in belts, not also using booster seats. And
talking about booster seats, we have somebody asking, is it better to use 4'9" as opposed to 80 pounds for the booster seat guidelines?
I would say the available evidence to date is that height is more important than weight. The current regulation that governs the performance of booster seats does have weight as one of the performance criteria. Those Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards are being considered for revision once we have an older age dummy that's available that can help us better assess the performance of booster seats for older kids. Again, the available data on which the recommendation was made on data that pertain to the height of the child, which does seem to be a more important factor when it comes to assuring belt fit.
Yes, and somebody did ask if we could hear the full reference for that data from UNTREE, which was a Kathy Clinic study, and it will be available, the full reference. I'll read it out to you here, but it will be available on the PDF version of the PowerPoint. It's Clinic et al., Study of Older Child Restraint Booster Seat Fit and NAS Injury Analysis. It was a study done for NHTSA, so it's at NHTSA, and it was conducted in 1994. Okay. And there's another question that I thought was very interesting, and can you address some of the concerns about the maturity of the iliac crests, and the proper positioning of the lap belt on larger children who may need to move out of a belt positioning booster seat earlier than expected?
Yes. So you may know that the lap portion of the belt is intended to be anchored by what are known as the anterior superior iliac spines. It's sort of a portion of the bony pelvis. The shape and development of that portion of the pelvis is quite different throughout childhood compared to our adult bodies, and in particular seems to mature quite rapidly during adolescence. Just as a somewhat side note, this probably explains part of the reason why we don't see a lot of pelvic fractures among young children until they've begun to reach early adolescence, and that may have something to do with the flexibility and maturity of their pelvis, which throughout adolescence just puts it at greater risk of being fractured. So the shape of that pelvis does more easily allow the lap portion of the belt to slide off of it. It does a much poorer job of anchoring the belt than a more mature pelvis. That's part of the reason that the use of a belt positioning booster seat helps to keep the lap portion of the belt more horizontal across, really, in some respects, the upper thighs, then more vertically oriented across the pelvis, because the pelvis simply won't be able to anchor that belt as well. So that's part of the reason why belt positioning booster seats work as well as they do, because they really not only change the positioning of the lap portion of the belt, they make the belt more horizontal across the child's upper thighs.
Okay. And just jumping around here to keep it interesting, there are a couple questions about car seat manufacturers' intentions to update their recommendations. That there's still some car seats out there that have the 1 year to turn forward facing at 1 year and 20 pounds, specifically a Costco seat and an even flow seat. And I don't think we can speak for the manufacturers, but perhaps these recommendations will encourage them that those last folks out there still saying 1 year and 20 pounds will update their information now. And I know, we've been communicating these recommendations to the manufacturers as well. That's fine. So this technically goes to 3:15. So we have time, so we'll just keep on going here with the questions. They're still here. We have a question asking about the 2011 Ford Explorer's optional inflatable rear seat belt and how that may affect child passenger safety and restraint use.
Good question. The short answer, not meant to sound terribly flip, is I don't know. There are some theoretical advantages as well as some theoretical concerns that we have about that inflatable belt system. I know that Ford underwent fairly significant internal testing of the belt system under a wide range of conditions and under laboratory conditions. They obviously were satisfied that the likelihood that their inflatable belt would cause an injury to any occupant, including children, was low enough that they put the product into their fleet. We remain very interested in these kinds of new innovations for restraint systems in vehicles. It's one of the reasons why having an effective child-focused motor vehicle crash surveillance system that can monitor these kinds of new technologies and their performance specifically for kids is so important. Some of you know that the Partners for Child Passenger Safety study has not been collecting data since 2007. We have really been without a child-focused motor vehicle crash surveillance system since that time. We are working, along with others, with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, trying to see if there's a way that we can leverage the existing motor vehicle crash surveillance systems that NHTSA operates to enhance their ability to collect child-specific data so that situations like that can be captured through an effective surveillance system when we can get some early real-world experience with the performance of that restraint system. It's a very good question. The simple answer is we have no real-world experience with it yet, though many of us remain interested in tracking that real-world experience as quickly as possible so that if there is an unintended consequence of it, it can be identified as soon as possible.
And Dennis, how do you recommend technicians and instructors get physicians involved in CPS to promote the most up-to-date info?
The Academy, I recognize that that's a big challenge. On the one hand, there's available evidence that said parents look to their pediatricians for this kind of advice and guidance. They see them as a trusted source of information. And the Academy clearly believes that every one of its members who is in primary care practice should have some fundamental knowledge base in child passenger safety that essentially consists of the information contained in this algorithm. The Academy also encourages its members who might be more motivated and interested to get additional information to use either in their practice or in their non-practice advocacy efforts. Again, I mentioned previously that the policy statement is trying to encourage pediatricians to identify child passenger safety technicians in their local community as well as other available online resources so that they can avail themselves of those resources when they're faced with a situation that goes beyond their own knowledge base. We're optimistic that these recommendations as well as some of the educational efforts around them will elevate the fundamental level of knowledge of most pediatricians in this country so that they can start more consistently delivering evidence-based recommendations in their practice. We are also trying to promote pediatricians to make connections with the child passenger safety technicians in their community. I would say to you, don't wait for the phone call from the pediatrician. Find out who the local pediatricians are in your area and seek them out and introduce yourself as a local resource that can provide some consultation to them when needed. Again, there's language in the policy statement and technical report encouraging the pediatricians to do that. So we're hoping that the connections between CPS technicians and pediatricians will be enhanced by these recommendations, and there's a role for both pediatricians and techs in ensuring that that happens.
Yeah, and I think what this does nicely is you're providing the pediatricians with the top-line information they need, but then also recommending that don't be intimidated by this, because you have child passenger safety technicians in your community that can address those difficult questions and technical issues that that they don't have to know all the ins and outs of. Let me just go on here. There's a few other. Any thoughts on the AP recommendations versus NHTSA's recommendations versus the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 213 requirements?
Well, if we could get that, there's a 10-year-old dummy that's in development. It has taken far longer than anyone would have ever imagined or hoped for to get that dummy to a point where it can be incorporated into regulation. However, it is NHTSA's desire to do so, and when that dummy is deemed ready, there's a particular problem with its neck and spine, that it does not represent adequately enough the movement of a child in a real-world crash, and would likely result in, sort of serendipitous data generated. So NHTSA is reluctant to put a measuring device in practice that doesn't measure what it's supposed to accurately enough. But on the assumption that improvements can be made to the dummy so that it does measure things accurately, that dummy will be the cornerstone of enhancements to 213 that will in particular govern the performance of booster seats for older and larger kids. That's the long-term movement on the part of NHTSA. But unfortunately, it does require a workable 10-year-old dummy, and there have been unanticipated problems with getting that dummy ready on the timeline. There was recent conversation around this. I believe Ray LaHood was quoted as saying that, the Department of Transportation Secretary was quoted as saying it's a priority to him to get this dummy developed as quickly as possible so that 213 can be revised. But I think realistically we're still looking at a several-year-long process here. In the meantime, the car seat manufacturers themselves have pretty rigorous internal testing procedures before they will rate their products for various ages and sizes. And while that's not an independent, government assessment program, I do believe that the car seat manufacturers are properly motivated to do rigorous internal testing of their seats and put seats in the marketplace with weight and height recommendations that they believe can provide adequate protection. And again, we're not seeing to date any real-world evidence that there are problems with the newer generations of seats in the marketplace.
Right, and here's a question that I know we've been hearing a lot when we were at Lifesavers and just out there on the social media, et cetera. How do we address the issue of children's leg length on the seat back of the vehicle when children are using the rear-facing convertible in advanced weight and length?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most common things we've been seeing, concerns on the part of parents with the rear-facing to age 2 recommendation. And I certainly understand the potential concern on the part of parents that their children may not only be less comfortable if they remain rear-facing longer, but is there actually, are they being placed at an increased risk of injury to the legs? The answer to that question is no. The available evidence from that 2007 study, as well as analyses that we've done on both NHTSA data as well as partners data, show no evidence that these older children from 1 to 2 years of age who remain rear-facing are at an elevated risk of leg injuries in the event of a crash. In fact, something that not many people know is that the second most commonly injured body region for forward-facing children, kids say 1 to 4 years of age that are in a forward-facing car seat, the first most important body region that's injured is the head, but the second most commonly injured body region for forward-facing kids is the leg, because frequently these legs flail in the event of a crash and become entangled or strike either other occupants or some of the interior components of the vehicle and are not uncommonly fractured. Again, I think in a rear-facing orientation for these older kids, it's highly likely that their legs, the movement of their legs will be better controlled And again, I suspect that over time we'll see a reduction in the risk of leg injuries to these 1 to 2-year-olds in crashes who are rear-facing compared to those who are forward-facing. I think this is what I anticipate pediatricians will encounter, you will encounter, is concerns on the part of parents. I also think that, it's not immediately clear to me that the way a 18-month-old might be comfortable is the same way I might be comfortable, or even an older child. So I think parents assume that their older children will be less comfortable, but kids are pretty creative about getting themselves comfortable in a variety of situations. So, and again, the vast majority of kids at this age often fall asleep in the car on even short drives, and I think one of the advantages to being rear-facing is that it's a more recumbent seating position, much more comfortable to sleep in than if you're forward-facing and more upright. And I'm sure many of you have seen, the incredible positions that kids can get their head and neck in when they fall asleep in a forward-facing car seat, all of which look very dangerous in the event of a crash. So I think in general the child will be more comfortable when asleep, and again, there's no evidence that there's an increased risk of injury to the legs.
And there's other questions coming up here regarding the 4'9" booster recommendation, and that persons of smaller stature could argue, well, they're barely 4'9", and do they need to be in a booster seat too? And I think perhaps that gets at the development of the iliac part of the spine. And another question in here was about what time does that iliac curve, I call it, form and kind of solidify, and if you could explain that connection.
Yeah, so it fully develops throughout adolescence. So I would say beginning at age 8 or so, and it's a slow incremental process until really the teen stops growing. So usually late, teenage years, maybe over about a 8 to 10 year long process. So it's really throughout adolescence that the pelvis is maturing. And yes, any small-statured adult may not fit properly in a vehicle seatbelt system. And we typically don't recommend boosters for small-statured adults, but there's no particular reason if an adult is willing to use one and can't get a good vehicle belt fit without one that they couldn't use one. I think that's going to be particularly challenging in the driver's position, but any other position, theoretically, a booster seat might help. And again, these guidelines, 4'9", 8 to 12 years of age, are meant to capture the vast majority of kids out there. The 95th percentile for the 5th percentile for a 12-year-old in height is 4 feet 9 inches. So we would expect 5% of 12-year-olds to be smaller than that. And so again, there will be situations that fall outside these guidelines, and in which case, pediatricians, families, technicians are all encouraged to use your best judgment about where the right place is for a child to sit and in what type of restraint system and what is most likely to be utilized most consistently. Again, the last thing we want to do is for people to not be restrained at all, and so any form of restraint is better than none, and the extent to which we can optimize that on every trip is obviously our desired goal.
And there's been some questions here. We're right at the end here, but that asking whether or not this is a recommendation to pediatricians. It's not a requirement from the Academy to pediatricians that they must, promote these new recommendations. Merely a recommendation to promote these.
Right. The policy statement really reflects the Academy's official position on child passenger safety. And the Academy would expect that all of its members would adopt these practices in the care of children. Of course, and the Academy will undertake several efforts that we've already talked about to ensure that as many of them as possible do so, but the Academy has a limited ability to prescribe or enforce that these recommendations be made by pediatricians in their day-to-day practice. Again, I think over time we'll see more and more of them do so. It'll become more of the norm. And as a younger generation of pediatricians goes into practice who's been used to this kind of information, I think these recommendations will really be embraced by pediatricians.
Okay. Well, that's all we have time for, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today and really wanting to get up to speed on what's the evidence and the implications of these new recommendations. I hope you found them useful, and I hope you know to go to the AAP.org website where you can find the policy statement and technical report. You can come to CHOP.edu/car-seat to get a video of this webinar, the PDF of this webinar, as well as a podcast of Dennis explaining this in terms that might be more palatable to families. And so there are resources out there, and I hope you will tap into them. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a great day.